So that's the creeks and communities section. With that, I'll take questions from anybody in the audience. Not hearing any questions, so maybe that was pretty all well understood. And so we'll move forward into this riparian proper functioning condition. And of course, the focus of this is this riparian area. We talk about the aquatic zone, but next to it is that transition zone, that riparian zone that transitions between the aquatic and the upland. And it turns out that that riparian zone is fundamentally important to both the upland zone because it's an important part of the habitat for much of the biota up there, but also it's fundamentally important to the aquatic zone because it structures that aquatic zone and allows it to have the qualities and conditions that are important. So riparian proper functioning condition, what do we mean by that term? Well, it's kind of complicated because people use the term in a variety of ways. It is a process for assessment. We'll talk about that. It's also a defined condition, and we'll provide the definition. But it's also a starting point for management and for spiraling up. By using this, we can develop a common language among many different disciplines, scientific disciplines, and agencies and landowners, and so we create an interdisciplinary team approach. And sometimes PFC is used to convey any of those. There are a couple of manuals that we will focus on today. On your left there is the new Dickard et al. It's the replacement for the LODIC systems. LODIC means running water, as we'll talk about. So this is the basic manual that is an interagency manual, and it was newly released just last summer. So we'll talk quite a bit about the blue one. But some of our riparian areas are not running water systems. They're more slow water systems or standing water systems. And so there's another 1737-16 guide for lentic areas, the slow-moving water wetland areas that also need functions. So the good news is that because these manuals keep getting revised and used, PFC has had more peer review than most assessment methods used by agencies. It's been used for over 20 years. There's been training by the state teams, and there's lots of tools for developing a common vocabulary. Throughout these slides, you'll see that some of the letters are in blue and some in black. And the reason for that is that the blue letters describe things that are perhaps new. Some of them are definitely new. Some of them maybe we were using before, but they're re-emphasized in the new version, the version 2, the 2015 version. That version particularly expands on pre-work and stratification because it's recognized that that kind of before you go to the field office work makes a huge difference when you get to the field about being able to understand what you see. And so the national team and the authors really emphasize that. Potential is described in detail, a bit more than it was previously. The concept of capability is removed, but it's replaced by a related concept called altered potential. Guidelines help users evaluate how human alterations affect potential, and about also the question of whether it's appropriate to do a PFC assessment in a particular place. The new manual includes observational indicators and lots of examples. It talks about some new science, of course science marches on, and so we know a tremendous amount about riparian areas that we did not understand at the beginning of my career. I used to have the audacity to think that I could collect all of the riparian literature, and I've given up on that. There's just a huge amount of it, and so there's lots of new science which helps us clarify the assessment items and the wording. There's a bit more detail. There's also some quantitative procedures that can be used to back up this qualitative process of PFC assessment. And so those quantitative procedures are explained in Appendix B. It provides calibration where answers are uncertain. The ID team can collect quantitative data and it provides the references that can be used to interpret that data to accurately and precisely monitor changes in a particular attribute. There is now, wasn't to begin with, but there is now a Burton et al. LODIC Riparian monitoring protocol called Multiple Indicator Monitoring, MIM, and there's a validation table in that MIM protocol that leads to very helpful data for making PFC calls. For 16 of the 17 items, there's a quantitative metric for various PFC items. There's also measurements and references and interpretation notes. The one that they don't have quantitative methods for is vigor. I remember being taught in grad school, don't talk about vigor because you can't measure it, and indeed we don't have good metrics for that. Sometimes you can see it, and it's useful, but it isn't as measurable as the other 16 items are. So PFC is an assessment tool, and because these riparian areas are complex, it requires an interdisciplinary team. It requires people who really understand vegetation, hydrology, soils, biology, and they need to have local, on-the-ground experience in interpreting the quantitative sampling techniques that support the PFC assessment, so they can go do it if they need to. And because they've spent the early part of their career doing that quantitative monitoring, they've developed a depth of personal experience that helps give them wisdom about knowing what is potential in a given location, or what to expect and what the systems need. In addition to that sort of technical, often agency-based group, not always, you also need the engagement of the people who have the in-place knowledge, the landowner, the permittee. Sometimes these ranch families go back multi-generations, and they have learned about the variation in flows and the variation in wet years and dry years and the things that have happened to the creek. They can tell stories about things that have made huge differences to streams. We were on a creek where the landowner explained that back in the 60s they had government funding to channelize the stream, and that's why they could no longer catch fish on their ranch. And when he understood how that connected up with riparian functions, it both made him very sad that they had ever done that, but also very happy to understand that there was a solution, a way to fix some of those problems that were legacy problems from a long time ago. The ID team needs to start by reviewing existing documents. There's a lot in the office, a lot published about riparian areas, as we mentioned, a lot of publications that are available at no cost through the National Riparian Service website, which you can easily Google. And with that, you can determine attributes and processes that are key to the area being addressed. You know, different parts of the country have different sorts of weather systems, and that timing and amount of precipitation has a huge influence on watersheds and the kinds of flows expected. There's also differences in geology and lots of other things. So starting in the office, trying to understand those things is appropriate. Using remote sensing and maps that explain about gradient and where the mountains are and where the valleys are helps begin that process of understanding potential or of altered potential. Sometimes the channelized reaches stand out glaringly in an air photograph. Helps begin with this process of determining the functioning rating, and provide, in the end, after doing that functional rating, which is both from in the office as well as the field, the team provides written comments on all of the items that they do. So the interdisciplinary team is critical. They do lots of things, important things. Because we're an interdisciplinary approach, we need an interdisciplinary training team. In Nevada, we have a diversity of disciplines. I've colored each discipline with a different color here. We also have a diversity of agency entities, and on this list, you see those people with the different colors. And so that diversity of backgrounds is key to doing PFC, because it's designed to be useful to assess physical function of perennial and intermittent streams. It can be used on most stream and river systems. It is meant to be used by an experienced interdisciplinary team and to provide a consistent approach for assessing physical function of riparian areas. When you do that, it helps establish, focus, and prioritize management and monitoring and restoration activities, provides a focus and effective foundation for determining resource values and developing management goals to communicate fundamental riparian concepts. It is used to both assess the situation on the ground. It's an assessment process of the on-the-ground condition. It is a minimum level or a starting point for riparian area stability and sustained function. PFC is a qualitative assessment, but it is based on quantitative science. It's sort of like when you go to the doctor and have an earache or some other malady. The doctor can, if he or she needs to, take quantitative data, send samples to the lab. Often, though, the doctor can make a diagnosis by doing a qualitative assessment. But that qualitative assessment is based on quantitative science, and we find that even with the complexity of riparian areas, we can do this with an interdisciplinary team. What PFC is not designed to do is to assess the function of ephemeral systems, those places on the land that water flows in response to storms, but it doesn't flow long enough to provide the kind of soil moisture needed by the water-loving riparian plants. It's not designed to be completed without an interdisciplinary team, and it's not designed to assess specific resource values or to be the only method for assessing the health of aquatic or terrestrial components of a riparian area. It is tremendously useful, but it isn't the only thing out there. PFC is not designed to assess functions where human alterations have created artificial channel conditions. Those artificial channel conditions don't function and they don't depend on functions. They depend on engineering, usually. And PFC is not designed to evaluate engineering. It is also not designed to normally equate to desired conditions. It is the foundation upon which those desired conditions get built by the system with those functions. And it's not meant to replace watershed analysis. The riparian areas are usually only a small part of the watershed, and although we look at the watershed, it doesn't replace the sort of complete watershed analysis that teams of people are doing in a lot of places. PFC is not monitoring. It is not a replacement for quantitative inventory or monitoring, but it complements more detailed methods by providing context to synthesize data and to communicate results. And so if you've got quantitative monitoring data or inventory data, you get more value from those data with PFC assessment than you do without that PFC assessment. But PFC cannot provide more than strong clues about actual habitat conditions for plants and animals or eliminate the need for more intensive inventory or monitoring protocols. It isn't designed for that. It is designed to focus on a part of the watershed that is critically important in this job that watersheds do, to capture, store, and safely release the water from precipitation so that we have water between the precipitation events that is needed for that whole watershed to function properly, to do that job that it has to do, and to provide the kinds of habitats and values that it can have. So riparian areas, a form of wetland transition between aquatic and adjacent upland, and they have the vegetation physical characteristics that reflect that permanence of water or subsurface water, or at least the water is there for long enough during the year that it can grow those kinds of special riparian plants that we've learned have the tremendous root and other characteristics that allow them to do the work when the floods come. So it's the land adjacent to perennial or intermittent streams, springs, seeps, ponds, etc. Now, some of those are going to be lotic and some lentic, but they're all riparian area. And so to focus a bit more on this idea of how long the water needs to be there. Certainly if it's a perennial stream, a stream that flows continuously, we can do PFC there, unless it's in a very altered system. If it's intermittent or seasonal, a stream that flows only at certain times of the year, but long enough to grow the riparian plants, then PFC is meant to be used there, but it's not for ephemeral systems. And if you've got an interrupted stream that has perennial parts and ephemeral parts, you could use it on that part that has the water long enough to grow the riparian vegetation, but not on the dry parts of the interrupted channel where only occasional floods may flow. So when you come to a stream, you begin to observe that stream, and you observe, in this case, that we've got a high gradient stream with a lot of rock and a lot of energy dissipation happening because of the rock. We also see riparian plants, and we realize that some different plants live close to the water. They provide some habitat values. But in this case, they're not the structural glue that holds the system together so much. In other systems, they are. In this system, we have decomposed granite and finer soils that could easily be washed away were it not for the combination of the roots of those plants, the form of the channel maintained by the roots of those plants, the floodplain access maintained by that combination. In here, we find a stream that really depends on woody vegetation, and the shrubs are fundamentally dissipating energy. And in this case, we find that a beaver dam is an important part of the overall mechanism for maintaining the stability of this system through time. Beaver dams built a lot of the valley bottoms throughout the nation. They have been keystone species geomorphically, hydrologically, and providing the kind of habitat that many other organisms have very much focused on.